believe in the ripple effect.
What's up? What's up? We're back. Another amazing, great episode of the Ripple Effect Podcast. Of course, I'm your host, Ricardo Rendes, also known as Ricky Franz. And today we have Peter Forcelli. He worked 15 years for NYPD, the Bronx Homicide Task Force. He also worked for the ATF and is a Operation Fast and Furious whistleblower. And we do talk a lot about Operation Fast and Furious and also his new book called Deadly Path: How Operation Fast and Furious and Bad Lawyers Armed Mexican Cartels. But we do spend a large part of the beginning of the conversation talking about a lot of his personal experiences working at the NYPD and being on the Homicide Task Force, also his experience and relationship with 9/11. Then we get into Operation Fast and Furious, his book, what he saw, what happened, all the corruption and conspiracies circulating the story, and also how and why he became a whistleblower. Then eventually we talk about current events, some of the stuff that's going on in the world today, some of his opinions on it, like the border crisis and other things. So get ready for amazing conversation. I know I say that often, but this episode, just like many past episodes, is one of those episodes that you're really going to learn a lot from somebody else's experiences, and we get into that. Obviously, working for NYPD and the Homicide Task Force, you see a lot of things, you experience a lot of things, and it really was a pleasure to hear about some of those experiences. But before we get into this conversation, I have to remind you guys, this is a value for value show. If you get some value from the episodes and conversations I bring to you, please consider giving some value back. Like I always remind you, it doesn't have to be financial. There's plenty of ways you can support the show by sharing the show, rating the show, liking the show, subscribing to the show on whatever platform you watch or listen to the Ripple Effect Podcast. I'll also remind you that this show is open source, so feel free to post it. You can also clip out parts that you enjoyed and share it on any social media platform you're on. But if you are in a good financial situation, please consider supporting the show financially. There's plenty of ways of doing so. You can support us, of course, monthly on Patreon, and no donation is too little. If a very small percentage of the people who listen and watch the Ripple Effect Podcast donated as little as $1 a month, and really think about it, what's $1? We go to the gas station, we go to a convenience store, we go to a grocery store. There's nothing you can buy for $1, but you can support a show you enjoy, a show that hopefully helps you get through your workday or your commute, or gives you a little food for thought if you want something thought-provoking. So if you can donate as little as $1 a month, please do. Other ways of financially supporting the show is sending a one-time donation to our PayPal account or our Venmo account, or sending us crypto to our crypto wallet. You can send Bitcoin or Ethereum. And then, of course, we also have a merch store if you want to get some merch, mugs, cups, t-shirts, v-necks, hoodies, kids' clothes, all types of stuff. Please check out the Ripple Effect Podcast merch.com. It's in the show description or on our website, the rippleeffectpodcast.com. But the URL, the Ripple Effect Podcast merch.com, will take you directly to the merch store. And then, of course, we have some sponsors. Content Safe is how I get my videos on all the video platforms I'm on. Minds, BitChute, Rockfin, Rumble, Band.video, and a few others. They also run my website. So if you're a streamer, YouTuber, podcaster of any sort, and you're sick of uploading to all the platforms you're on, hit up Content Safe. Let them know you're a listener of the Ripple Effect Podcast, and they'll definitely take care of you. The next sponsor is the University of Reason and the very popular autonomy courses created by Richard Grove. If you're at a crossroads in life, if you're looking to connect with a community, liberty-minded, freedom-minded community, if you're looking to learn some new skills, expand on some skills you have, or just take some thought-provoking courses that can really bring value to your life, check out the University of Reason. Please use the links in the show description and you can help yourself and the Ripple Effect podcast at the same time. And then the last sponsor is Element Electrolytes, created by a OG in the health and nutrition community, Rob Wolf. Rob's a documentary filmmaker, best-selling author. Maybe you've run into some of his work like Sacred Cow. He's been on the Joe Rogan podcast. He started the first CrossFit gym in the U.S. He's a jiu-jitsu black belt. He used to do bodybuilding. He's trained a bunch of professional athletes. So he knows his stuff. And what he did is he created a product that gave you all the electrolytes you needed and none of the stuff you don't need. It won't kick you out of fasting. It won't kick you out of ketosis. It has sodium, potassium, magnesium. It's sweetened with stevia, so no sugar. It won't affect your insulin levels or your blood sugar levels. And most importantly, it tastes awesome. It gives you an alternative to water, and it'll help you optimize your body and mind and help with many symptoms that are due to dehydration, like headaches, cramping, muscle fatigue, and many other symptoms that you might not even know are due to dehydration. Same thing with hangovers. This will also help you with just getting over your hangover, because a lot of your hangover is due to dehydration. If you use the link in the show description, you get a free gift with every purchase, and you support the Ripple Effect podcast. Also, when you use that link, you'll find tons of science backing his formula and all the benefits that come with using Element Electrolytes. They're just little packets of electrolytes that taste awesome. You put them in your water, you shake it, you drink, and off you go. You can stay hydrated. You can help with optimizing your workout, your sport you're playing, or just enjoying something that tastes good that will keep you hydrated, because drinking water will get hydration into your blood, but to really get it into the tissue, you need electrolytes. Like I said, please use the link in the show description to get a free gift with every purchase and support the Ripple Effect podcast. Thanks again, guys. Enjoy this amazing conversation with Peter Forcelli. Hopefully you guys enjoy his life journey and hearing about it as much as I did. And I will talk to you guys in the next one. Peace.
Yonkers, New York. Very diverse area. In fact, we were like one of 6 white families that were left there. So I had friends from all different backgrounds. Growing up, I didn't see things through the prism of race. When I was younger, for some reason, there was an incident that happened across the street from my house where the police were doing some sort of activity and it turned into a shooting. And I remember being intrigued by how the police were the only folks that could cross onto the other side of the yellow tape. And, and I'd watched a lot of police shows growing up, and, you think watching TV, it's all about excitement and everything. So, at age 16 and a half, I took the test to become a New York City cop, because you could back then. You couldn't get hired then. So I had to wait a few years till I was old enough to get on. But I got hired by the NYPD at age 20. Back then, there was 3 different departments. There was the New York City Housing Police, the Transit Police, and the NYPD. I actually got picked for the Housing Police. So I started my career walking a beat in the projects in the Bronx, patrolling some pretty rough areas. But you got to learn real quick that most of the people that lived there were good people. They were just stuck there by circumstance. And you really get an understanding of folks in those circumstances, because you're just, you're there with them. They get to know you, you get to know them. And sure, some of the folks were bad and you deal with them appropriately. But you realize that a lot of the folks there are just good people who were trapped because of their financial situation. And, so I was a cop, walked the beat for a number of years, and eventually got into a car. You had to earn a seat in the car. Did that. Got into a plainclothes unit for a while, which was exciting because you're mostly going after felons in those units. And then I got into the detective bureau. So I was a generalist detective for a couple of years in the housing authority. Then they merged. Giuliani came in 95. They merged the departments together. So I wound up starting in the 47th Precinct Detective Squad, which is the North Bronx, which during that year was the most violent year. They led the city in homicides, so a great place to learn how to work murder cases. And then I eventually wound up going to the Bronx Homicide Squad, and that's where I worked with some really just talented folks, but also got to work with the feds a lot, because New York had finally come around to acknowledging something that the cops knew, is that they had a gang problem. So I was working a bit with FBI agents, DEA agents, and I worked a lot with ATF agents, and felt like had more impact because the sentences were longer. The district attorney's office in the Bronx was kind of weak, didn't really have an appetite to go after criminals like the U.S. attorney's office in Manhattan did. So it was dealing with those folks that kind of sold me on leaving the NYPD to go join ATF. And it's weird because I really love being a cop in New York, and I love being a homicide detective there. Like walking a beat there. It's not that I didn't like the job. I just felt like I'd have, you know, just more ability to do things and get stuff done as a Fed. So I became an agent in New York. I was there for about 6 years as just a regular line agent. Promoted to a group supervisor's position in Phoenix. Was there for 5 years. That's where I saw some things that really bothered me and led me to speaking up. And then after that happened, dealt with about 4 years of investigations and retaliations, which we could talk about later. And then finally, when I was done with that, I was put in charge of training at ATF, leadership training primarily. And then did a year there, went down to Florida. I was the head of the ATF office in Miami during Pulse nightclub shooting, the Parkland shooting, and the Fort Lauderdale airport shooting. And then after about 3 years in that position, I came back to headquarters, was in charge of all training and recruiting and hiring for the organization when I left. But yeah, in October of 2021, I retired. And now I'm, law enforcement's biggest critic when they get it wrong and their biggest cheerleader when they get it right. And, just trying to stay busy and do things that, keep me occupied.
Yeah, and meaningful things. I think that's so important. I mean, there are a lot of good and bad people everywhere, and it's
Yeah.
it's always a mix. You talked about, we have a little family construction company, and we do certain contracts that are in like really poor areas of. I live in Massachusetts, so in like Springfield or Holyoke, and some of these cities have really bad areas, and you'll see these little kids who walk around and they'll talk to you. They'll make small talk, and you're thinking to yourself, I'm like, this kid has very little chance to get out of here. I mean, you never see the parents around. He's surrounded by violence and people who are on drugs and people who are, struggling or been around violence themselves. And, that you realize like that saying, hurt people, like it makes perfect sense. And it's a cycle. And it's like, how do you break this cycle? And, obviously that's where a lot of people get political and a lot of people have different philosophies on how do you fix these type of problems that are so deep rooted. And because I mean, kids are a product of their environment, and if that's their environment, the chance, I mean, and there are success stories, right? You hear the people are like, hey, I grew up in the worst part of this city and I got out of it. It's like, yeah, well, for some reason, something inspired you. It was either a mentor, a book, a movie, something, stuck with you. It's no different than hearing your story about watching those police being able to go under the yellow tape. Like when you're a kid, you never know like what thing for whatever reason sticks with you, what piece of advice, what little discussion you have with some adult who took the time to explain something to you or talk to you. In your personal opinion, being in the trenches and seeing all this, how do you fix some of these issues?
Well, one of the things that bothers me now is this reluctance to put people in jail. And listen, I don't think we can arrest our way out of everything. I don't. But I saw, like, for example, when I was in the Bronx Homicide Squad, we started this program called Operation Trigger Lock, where we went after folks that were misusing guns and we put them in federal prison because when they were going into the Rikers Island, which is the main jail in New York City, huge facility, they'd come out quickly and they'd just reoffend. So what happened was when Trigger Lock started, the homicide rate in the Bronx was roughly 600 a year, right? So by taking some of these guys, because not everybody's bad and not everybody's going to arm themselves, and even of the people who are armed, not everybody's out there willing to hurt somebody. So when we knew that there were folks that were from that ilk, we'd put them in federal prison. And the homicide rate over 3 years, while that program was going on, dropped to under 200 murders a year. And it's because the really violent folks were taken off the street. But to your point earlier, it was heartbreaking as a cop and then later as a detective. You paid attention. When I walked the beat, I would see little kids getting on a school bus in the morning. And then at the end of the day, I would see them getting off the school bus and going home. And you didn't see them in the park. You didn't see them in the playground because the playgrounds were littered with crack vials, hypodermic needles, because heroin was a thing in the Bronx even back then, and spent shells. So, the parents who tried to raise their kids to go there and be engineers and doctors and have productive lives that wouldn't let their kids just run amok, you'd only see those kids like if you looked up at the buildings looking out the windows, which is kind of tragic because here you have kids that are supposed to be outside playing and doing sports and doing the things that folks in other parts of the country can do. So they were prisoners of their own apartments, which is tragic. So by taking the really bad people, and there's not a lot of them, and putting them away, you allow folks to live their lives. So I mean, for a while in the late 1990s, New York City got better. I mean, Times Square, for example, was an open air drug market in the 80s and early 90s, where you could not walk down the street without being approached by somebody who wanted to sell you drugs or drag you into one of the sex shops that they had going on there. Then in the late 90s, early 2000s, that same area, which you just didn't walk through unless you wanted to go there and, go to a peep show or something, or you were looking for drugs or fake IDs, turned into a place where you got the Pokemon store. Disney had a store there. I believe the Hard Rock Cafe, some other big box stores and restaurants opened up there. So it became very safe. But it's through law enforcement. But see, one of the things I think that law enforcement does wrong, community policing worked. And that's when you know who you're dealing with, you treat them with respect. There has to be that relationship. You have to build that trust. So it's like sometimes law enforcement they're guilty of chasing the shiny balls. Like some new thing will come out, and intelligence-led policing, or you name the flavor of the day, and then they go chase it and they abandon some of the things that worked. And I think as a result, what happens is, sometimes when folks don't know the cop who's patrolling their neighborhood and they don't trust them, you're not going to have that very important interaction that you need to keep people safe, you know?
Yeah, that's huge. I have a lot of police officer friends, and I've made a lot more just working construction than working details with us, and then just small talking. So throughout the years, I've made a lot of friends that are police officers, and you hear a lot about that, right? And the media hasn't helped. It's um my son's godfather is a detective and a police officer. So my kids have always been around police officers. They like police officers. So we were in Atlantic City for a futsal tournament, indoor soccer tournament. And a cop was outside, and my daughter's like, "Hey, policeman!" And he almost seemed like startled, but he's not used to, And I remember telling my wife, I'm like, he probably wasn't expecting that, because he's like, they've been demonized so much that he's like, now people still, they talk about how they still wave at firemen, but he's like, police officers have been, looked at like they're, the enemy, like that it's the police against the people, right? And it's police they're kind of like attorneys, right? That's saying nobody likes them until you need one.
Right. No, but I mean, look, it's unfortunate because people want to feel safe, and look, the police are demonized, and when they get it wrong, they should be held to account.
Absolutely.
But we have a criminal justice system where there's a presumption of innocence until you're found guilty. And a lot of people want to blame the cops right away for things, which doesn't benefit anybody. And here's the other thing: look, with body cameras now and cell phones, use of force is not a pretty thing, but there's a thing called necessary use of force. It's supposed to be the minimum amount needed to take someone into custody. It still doesn't look pretty. So these folks who have, embraced the whole, defund the police, or who right away bash the cop is instantly wrong for putting hands on somebody. Look, sometimes that has to happen, but it's not pretty. But what's far uglier? Like, again, that was maintaining order. When you lose control of a city and someone decides, hey, it's time to restore order, that's far uglier than when you just maintain it all along. So I think at some point when the pendulum swings, it's not going to be pretty, but folks just need to be patient and realize that sometimes that's how it looks. And look, when cops get it wrong, they should be held to account. So I'm not defending bad policing. In fact, nobody hates a bad cop more than a good cop. And I learned that through 35 years in the profession. The police don't tolerate that sort of idiocy amongst their ranks. So I mean, but it'll be interesting to see how things play out in the next couple of years, because some of the cities that were once very safe have really gotten out of control, and it's sad for the folks that live there.
Yeah, without a doubt, that's a good way of putting it. That nobody hates a bad cop worse than a good cop, because, like you said, it paints a picture of, this person now represents all of us.
Yes.
And the thing is, that should go both ways, right? Like, you have people that are like, hey, this black person or this Mexican person or this immigrant, whatever country they're from, whatever race or nationality they are, like, it's like, oh, just because of their nationality, they're not necessarily bad, but they're also not necessarily innocent either, right? And
Right.
I'm Portuguese, I was born in Portugal, came here as a young person. Like, there's bad Portuguese people, there's good Portuguese people. Like,
Right. Right.
the shitty Portuguese person to represent all Portuguese people, So, but people don't look at issues as each individual issue as its own event. People look at a event and you're either like for the cops or you're against the cops, and they don't look at all the details. And I'm like, there's plenty of situations where you can analyze the situation and be like, you know what, the cop was right in this situation. And then there's times where you're like, you know what, maybe he could have handled it differently. But I also understand, and this is funny because this is something I've asked a good friend of mine who's my son's godfather. I'm like, hey, like when you first become a police officer and you get that call, right? You literally have no idea what you're getting yourself into. Like it could be something as mild as like, a grandmother, fell, or it could be people on drugs who are violent and have weapons, and your heart must be pumping. And, to think like any any call could be your last call, right? And I'm like, cops know that. And that's why sometimes you're like, hey, I'm a good guy. Why are you giving me a? It's like you don't understand. Like, if you were in their perspective and you're going up to a car, you're going into a house or whatever, like, you have no idea what, you have minimal information. You have no idea what you're getting yourself into. Like, yeah, like, all those worst case scenarios are going through your head, I'm sure. And it's like, so people have to see it from their perspective. I think that's something that like the average person struggles to understand. Like, you know, that's scary. Like even as myself trying to put myself in that situation, I'm like, I remember asking my buddy, I'm like, does the adrenaline rush ever go away? Did it ever go away for you? Like, did you ever get to a point where maybe, you got too comfortable, or do you always try to convince yourself like, hey, don't ever get too comfortable, like always understand like any of these, because I feel like that's probably where when mistakes can be made, right? Like when you get too comfortable.
Right. No, look, you're always on your guard. But what happens as a result of that, you have all of these chemicals going through your body, adrenaline and everything. And look, sometimes, that hypervigilance would take it out of you when you would get home, because now you can let your guard down. So all those chemicals, like they go away. So you're almost exhausted. So I mean, there were times I'd be sitting home and, just not have the energy, or I'd be like just checked out. My wife would have to call me 2 or 3 times before I'd snap out of it and respond to her. And it was because of that same chemical, the chemicals that are going through you when you're at work that now are not in your body when you're sitting home, which doesn't always make for great relationships. Luckily I have a very patient wife, but yeah, you're spot on. And look, the other thing is, when you're out there acting in law enforcement, sometimes you have seconds or split seconds to make decisions that folks have days, weeks, months, years to analyze. So, I mean, that's the thing folks forget too, is, you're making decisions to the best of your ability. And look, I got a lot of them wrong, never got anybody seriously hurt or anything like that. But I mean, just that's human nature, so people who expect perfection out of law enforcement are always going to be disappointed, because it's human beings making decisions, sometimes hundreds of decisions in one day, and if you expect them to get it right each and every time, it's not going to work out that way.
Do you see any issues with the type of people that are becoming officers now? I feel like back in the day, you'd see a lot of guys that were more masculine, more alpha males, maybe, jocks. And now you're hearing about like, at least, in Massachusetts, I hear from, some officers about like how it's all about, testing. And you get these guys who maybe never were alpha males, never were had much confidence, and now you give them a badge and a gun, and maybe it goes to their head a little bit. Do you have any thoughts on that? Do you find that to be true by any stretch?
Well, I never looked at it from alpha male, beta male perspective. I'd have to think about that. But what I will say is things have changed in a way that's pretty apparent, and that's first off is when I came onto the police department, the people who trained me had a lot of time on the job. Captains were old men with white hair. Now you have a captain that could be 30 years old. So there's a lot of experience that's gone. So you have folks being trained by people that don't have a lot of time on the job. So, which is a recipe for disaster, number one. The second thing that I'll say is like, I grew up in a time where we played, and again, I said earlier, I grew up in a very ethnically diverse area. So I played stickball, played touch football, played tackle football. So when you're doing that, right, you get to know people, but you also get there's skills aside from the sport that come along with that. because hey, didn't like that call, so you get into an argument. So you had to learn how to negotiate with kids your own age, or sometimes people different ages, a little bit above, a little bit below, or even adults at times. If you bounced the tennis ball off somebody's car and they didn't like it, you had to learn how to de-escalate. You had to learn how to communicate. That's not as common thing now because so many folks play video games at home where they're not out dealing with other kids, and then when there is conflict they don't de-escalate it, so they don't learn that skill. So mommy or daddy comes out and has to deal with it. So I mean, I think there's a benefit to folks being involved in playing sports and going out there and hanging out with other people their own age. That's not as prevalent now as it was 20, 30 years ago. So I think that factors into things when you get someone who takes a test to be a police officer, or any profession really that involves human interaction, and you're dealing with people who don't have those skills, and it's not their fault sometimes, because that's just how kids are raised now. They have very strong thumbs, but not necessarily very strong communication skills.
And what you're hitting on and highlighting in regards to not having those elders with the wisdom to hand down that life experience so you can learn from it, that's a complete social issue, cultural issue. I think not just in policing, but I think in all aspects of life. People used to admire, or like I remember growing up and I always wanted to be around the adults because I would always learn something, right? I would listen to their stories, and the adults would always be mad because they wanted to tell a story, but they could tell I was paying attention. Then eventually, like, okay, well, we're just going to keep talking because he's always paying attention, he's always listening, and I always wanted to kind of extract some wisdom and some knowledge from the elders, and now it's like it's a cultural problem where like now we celebrate the young and the reckless, and we celebrate just I mean nobody we look at old people as old people, not wise people, or
Right.
people with wisdom. And I think that's a just a cultural issue. Would you agree with that?
Oh, wow. You just nailed it. I mean, that's such an important thing to say. I mean, look, in most cultures around the world, people still respect their elders because they've lived through things. I mean, there's wisdom in experience. And there's as a police officer, there's wisdom in the experience of the guys who came before me. When I started as a detective, some of the guys that were in my squad were around in the Serpico days. So they had seen it all. And I can't even begin to describe what a gift it was to be able to work with them and to steal some of their knowledge. And look, one of the things I tried to do when I was getting towards the end of my career was to at least try to pass some of that knowledge on. And a lot of folks were very receptive to it. But to your point, there were some people who were like, hey, I'm not going to learn anything from you. I went through the academy. I got my badge and my gun. I'm an agent just like you. Take a walk. So, but no, you're spot on. There's so much to be learned from the experience of others. And it's even, partially why I wrote the book that's coming out next week is, if you don't know history, you're bound to repeat history. So those folks, I was learning from the mistakes that they had made throughout their lifetime. So for them to be willing to teach me was just a gift I could never really pay back. I try, but I mean, just such an important experience.
Yeah, that's why one of my favorite quotes is a smart person learns from their mistakes, a smarter person learns from other people's mistakes. And I
Yeah.
think it's so important to understand that. Like you don't have to necessarily experience things yourself to learn from it the same way somebody else learned from it. If you're willing to listen and hear about somebody's experiences and what they took away from it, you almost get a shortcut. You get the
Yes.
benefit of learning stuff that you didn't actually have to go through yourself and suffer and go through it, the ups and downs. So without a doubt, and being a police officer is absolutely it's almost a impossible job. I mean, there's a reason why the divorce rate is so high for police officers. I think it's because it's one of those jobs it's very hard to detach from. My couple of my police officer friends don't hang out with other police officers because they're like all they want to do is talk shop, and it's like we need to be able to like disconnect from it. And and it's funny, I remember my wife, she could care less about like the I shouldn't say care less, but like she's not as intrigued with like the topics that I hit on, history, whistleblowers, that type of topics that I have on the podcast. And at first I'm always like, this is awful. Like why can't we talk? And then it hit me. I'm like, okay, this is good because I can like get away from all the horrible things that are going on in the world for a little bit, and it's beneficial. But like you said, being exhausted when you get home, the emotional ups and downs, like adrenaline, all these things. I mean, you probably don't. You're like, how can I feel so physically exhausted if I don't feel like I did anything so physically exerting? But it's because of that emotional, ups and downs, and you're dealing with people. How do you disconnect from personally being involved with these people? You know their lives, what they're doing. I mean, it's kind of like that therapist type of mentality where you have to see it as work and be able to punch out. And could you do that? Did you feel like, is that one of the traits you had?
You know what? I sucked at it. What I had, to be honest with you, and it's funny. I talked about this recently with a friend who was the cold case squad commander for NYPD. So he was worked on all the old murders. Tom Joyce, great guy. We had FOMO, right? Because when you're a cop, if you really like the job, and I love the job, you want to be there for the foot chase. You want to be there for that big incident. You want to be there for the homicide scene to help work the murder case. So you put so much time into the job that when you'd get home you'd still in your head still be at work, like you just mentioned. And that's not a healthy place to be, because look, the reality is I saw things that I can't unsee, whether it was a murder scene, where it was a child murdered. I remember a child that had been burned alive, was trapped in an apartment because the mother went out and went shopping, and came home. The refrigerator motor caught fire, so when we get there, this dead baby. Not something that you get out of your head. Or even from 9/11, I still can hear the sound of the jumpers who were jumping from the buildings on that day. So I mean, you see these things, and that's in your head too. So when you're caught up in the job, but thinking about the things that you saw that were really bad, and then you're thinking about your cases that are waiting for you when you're going back to work tomorrow, and you're wondering, how am I going to do this? Who am I going to interview next? Those things, they take a toll on you. So, but I was not able to check out until much, much later in my career, when I actually wound up getting lung cancer from 9/11. And I decided, hey, man, I came into this profession whole. I want to leave whole. And I realized I had all of these great memories of cases and people I work with and this funny event from patrol. And I didn't have those same memories with my wife and my kids going on vacations. And look, I went on vacations with them. But when I was on vacation, I was thinking about the job. So it wasn't until much later that I actually decided that I had to put a conscious effort into dialing it back and spending the quality time with the family. But I mean, look, my kids lost most of their childhood and teenage years, because they didn't have me there because I was so caught up in the job. So now they're both in their 20s, and I'm giving them the time that I should have gave them when they were much younger. Luckily, I have a great wife who was a great mother who gave them all the attention that they needed. So they were raised to be good kids. But I can't take a lot of credit for that because I wasn't here for them. Be honest.
Yeah, yeah, and that's awesome that you are honest about it, and it's awesome that you acknowledge it, and you say, you know what, I'm going to try to make up for lost time. It's never too late to make a wrong a right, right? So
Yeah.
without a doubt, and that's the other thing. Like, you can't unsee some of the things you guys have seen. I mean, I always hear about like the smell of a dead body and how you'll never ever forget the smell of it, and you know immediately, like, buddies of mine are like, you get in the house, like, I know they're dead, like, and they've been dead, and there's that smell that, knock on wood, I've never experienced, but like, I hear like that sticks with you forever.
Oh yeah, no. Listen, I can tell you that there were times, like, again, I started in the housing authority police department, so there were times where you would walk into a building because it would be a suspicious odor call, and the body would be on like the sixth floor. And as soon as you walked into the lobby, you knew, oh boy. And then there were times where we'd have to kick in the door sometimes because the person was dead in there. A family member might call and say, hey, we haven't heard from so and so in days. And then they get there and they smell something, they know what's going on. So we have to force the door open. There were plenty of times where as soon as that door flew open, I turned around and just threw up. I mean, the stench is unbelievable. The other thing is, I remember one where it's the first one actually that was really bad. Body had been decomposing for some time. There were maggots coming out of the body and flies grow out of the maggots. And I remember taking my uniform off and putting it in a garbage bag, and tying the garbage bag in a tight knot, throwing it in my trunk, driving home, and then putting it right in the washing machine. And then the following day, I got back in my car and almost threw up again because even though the uniform was in a bag, sealed in the trunk, the smell still permeated into the car. So the following day, I mean, it took a couple of days to go away, but you still smelled that disgusting, putrid smell in the car the following day, even though the uniform sat in your trunk in a bag. Horrible.
Yeah, and then also having to talk to the families, like I'm, having to tell family members that this happens, or this happened or that happened. They're dead, or they committed suicide, or they overdose. It's it's a crazy, crazy job. And, I just think the amount of discipline and emotional discipline to handle all those ups and downs and all those personal stories and experiences. It's like you're basically constantly seeing things that you're and constantly experiencing things that maybe like a handful of people should be experiencing in their lifespan once. It's like maybe you're unlucky enough to see a sibling overdose, but now you do a job that you could see that like on a weekly basis or monthly. It's wild. Yeah, it's crazy. And looking back at your career, do you think you've accumulated some trauma from those experiences, or do you think you've done a good job of like finding peace, finding happiness, and now doing work that's fulfilling and meaningful?
Well, no, I definitely had some trauma. I mean, like right after 9/11, the first thing that I dealt with was survivor's guilt. Because I mean, I was there at the South Tower when it collapsed, and I had watched three of my good friends walk into the plaza right there. And I knew that the instant the building started to fall, I barely got away. I knew that there's no way they got away. So I knew they were dead. And then I'd gone home like on the third morning, and I found out that in total, seven friends, six cops, and one fireman who was a cop that became a fireman all died on 9/11. And, I had for years gone to every police funeral in the area, not just in New York. If a cop died in Massachusetts, I drove up, attended the funeral, Connecticut, New Jersey, because I felt like it was a duty to pay respect to the fallen, because, profession's somewhat like a brotherhood. After 9/11, I couldn't go to those funerals because I didn't feel like I deserved to still be around. Like, why am I still here and those guys are gone? So I dealt with that for a while. And then eventually, driving past Ground Zero all the time because the U.S. Attorney's Office is very close to there, walking by there, it started to take a toll on me. And there was one time I was driving home, talk about doing something stupid, learning from mistakes, right? We talked about, I was driving home. By this time, I lived in New Jersey, and I was about 25 minutes to half an hour from my house, which was very close to a hospital. And I started to get wrenching chest pains. I'm like, oh shit, I'm having a heart attack. So what does an idiot do if they think they're having a heart attack? Smart people stop and call 911. And I was close to a toll plaza. I could have even like got help from the people there. I drove to the hospital. So I wind up going there. They did all the blood work and everything. They could tell there's enzymes if you're having a heart attack. They weren't there. So, after some discussion, the nurse and the doctor are like, hey, because you responded to 9/11, this is roughly 2006. So it's like 5 years later. They're asking me, do you think you potentially could have PTSD? And I remember not being, I mean, look, I'm not the kind of person that's going to be a complete asshole to them, but I was like defensive, like, no, I can't have that. I'm the police. People come to me for help. I don't need help. So they gave me a shot of Demerol. I went home. My couch never felt more comfortable in my life than that evening. I was driven home. So anyway, had a similar thing happen years later, and still in denial. And even then, the doctor's like, "Hey, you might have a little PTSD because your blood pressure's high, certain other things. There's nothing physically wrong with you other than the blood pressure." And it wasn't really until around the time I talked about earlier with the lung cancer that I decided, something. I came into this profession in one piece. I need to leave in one piece. So, in addition to making the family connections stronger, I actually first started speaking to somebody, and yeah, I had PTSD from 9/11 and probably from things before that, and it's weird because it was actually, I had come to this realization right before the Parkland shooting, because I had the lung cancer right before Parkland happened. And when I got to the Parkland scene, it affected me a lot different than all the murder scenes I had been to before that, because I let my guard down. Like, you build this shell to protect yourself from the bad things that you see through the years, and you think that that stuff isn't getting into your head. But when I let my guard down, man, like, it really affected me seeing the 16 dead children, and they were teenagers, but they're children, and that dead coach, because I was coming to terms with, PTSD and my own mortality at that time. So it's weird. But like now I just, I've come to terms with that fact that it's okay to not be okay. I mean, people are people. You can't always be strong. And if you need help, it's good to ask for that help. Because I mean, look, the police profession is a lot of suicide. There's a lot of alcoholism. There's a lot of folks that bottle things up and they never ask for help. And part of it was because it was a stigma back in the day that you just didn't do that. And now I'm glad to see that that's changing. And look, the reality is, I think a lot of it's changing because of what's going on in the veteran community. I have so much deep respect for the military, and some of those folks are coming back, not the same. And they've started to take the stigma off that profession. And I'm glad to see that they're doing it, but I'm also glad to see that that's also affecting first responders who are now starting to lose that stigma as well. Because look, man, people are human beings. We're not made of stone. And if something's bothering you, you should ask for help. But for years, people just it was taboo. You didn't do it.
Yeah, and you made a really good point about how sometimes you think because you're dealing with it pretty well that it's not bothering you, but it is. Maybe it's not conscious, but it's subconscious. It's somewhere in the back, and it's like sometimes it's something will spark some childhood trauma that you dealt with that you didn't even know was still in your memory bank that you thought like you have put way behind you, and all of a sudden those feelings and emotions come back and you realize like wow it's still there somewhere. And so yeah, without a doubt things don't go away, and it's that is definitely a good thing, the way that we look at mental health. And where people are taking it more seriously. It's not, we're not looking at people like, oh, you're some kind of wuss because you're saying that you have. I think we're asking people to deal with, to work through things that would cause the average person to have trauma. Like it's like if walked into, a suit. I remember across the street from where I grew up, a woman, I was a kid, and a woman, older woman, I don't know what her issues were, but she was nice and her husband was nice, Portuguese couple. They're both retired. They're supposed to leave to go to Portugal on a vacation. And he went out to maybe do some shopping or gather some things before leaving the next morning. And he comes home and she hung herself in the garage. And I remember being a kid, and like I didn't see the body. I just heard the story, and I'm like, I'm still talking about it today, right? Like it's stuck with me, right? And it's like, imagine being a police officer and now one event that can cause like a lifelong, scar into your memory bank. Like imagine dealing with that like all the time. I don't think like the human mind is capable of or even designed to deal with that type of stuff all the time. And maybe some people can gather immunity to it, but I'm not sure that's healthy either, in the long run.
Yeah.
But like I always say like we're super patriotic when we're sending people overseas, and then we become very less patriotic when they need help when they come back. And that part is just it drives me up a wall because September 11th was one of the events that really woke me up to like these bigger issues and made me passionate. And still seeing those videos, like you said, of people jumping out of a building, it almost doesn't even seem real. I look back and I watch those videos, I'm just like, it doesn't. I still have a hard time like just grasping the fact that those are real and that's not just a movie and CGI, or it's like you're just like that couldn't happen in America, and that couldn't, and then what they did to the first responders, they lied about the quality of air, they lied about, which, I'm sure is a part of maybe, was that one of the issues you saw with a lot of people like yourself that were there, and dealing, first responders and people who live in the city, could some of these health issues been avoided if they were honest about the quality of the air?
Oh, absolutely. I absolutely believe that. Look, I mean, I was there day one where, when the buildings collapsed, I was there, I breathed that stuff. And I never smoked a cigarette in my life and wound up getting lung cancer in 2018. But so, I mean, yeah, I breathed in stuff. There was no controlling that. But in the days that followed, people continued to come at them because the recovery went on for months, and not just at ground zero. They were doing work out at the landfill because they took the debris from ground zero, they barged it out to Staten Island, and people were breathing stuff in there too. So, I mean, my understanding is that they say that breathing in that stuff changed our DNA. But I lost, like I said, 7 friends on 9/11. I've lost more than 3 times that number to 9/11 related cancers or 9/11 related illnesses since then. And people are still dying and people are still getting cancer and getting sick from responding there. So, I mean, had they known early on that, respiratory protection might have been more important, then they may have taken those precautions. And then, like, we talk about the first responder population, which is cops and firemen, but you also had people that lived down there, kids that went to school down there. So sure, you couldn't get south of Canal Street for a while because of Ground Zero, but you had areas just on the perimeter of that where people were still living, going to school, working. They were breathing that same air. So it's terrible.
Now let's get in. I'm so good at getting us completely off topic. Sorry. But I find all these parts of your life and stories, and I'm unlike many of the young people of today. I love extracting wisdom from people who've lived some amazing lives and done some amazing things. But I'm sure listeners will be like, "Hey, can we get to Fast and Furious and that story?" Because I think a lot of people only kind of know the surface level of what happened, and it is a huge subject in your book, and among other things. How does your story lead to the Fast and Furious, Operation Fast and Furious? And maybe before we get into that, give people a rough, just kind of general description of what that was.
Sure, sure. Well, let me tell you something. We didn't get that far off track because the reason I left New York was because I couldn't deal with driving past Ground Zero. The PTSD was getting to me. I needed to get away. I figured a change of scenery would help. It doesn't help, but that was why I left. So I went to Phoenix, and while I was still in New York, we were working all these federal cases, a lot of these gun cases. So I mean, I had a lot of exposure to taking cases federally and understanding how the federal laws worked. So I got out to Phoenix and I was a brand new supervisor and I had a group, some good folks. Some of them had more time with ATF than I did. Some were somewhat newer. And what I saw was, I'll give you an example. My first weekend out there, one of my agents got a call from a licensed gun dealer who called and said, "Hey, man, there's a guy came in here. He asked how many AK-47 variant rifles I had on the shelves. The guy had roughly 13. The guy said, I'll take them all. Can you guys get out here? Because I don't want to let this guy leave." So we roll out and we would set up surveillance outside the store. And we watch this guy load the guns into the car. He drives off. He starts to get close to I-10, which is the interstate that leads south, can go to Tucson, and then beyond that to Mexico. And so we stopped him and we asked him and the other person that was in the car some questions. And they were, lying. They weren't consistent with one another. So that's like what cops do everywhere in the country, right? You do a car stop. If something's suspicious, you find out what's going on. You separate people, you get their stories. If their stories are conflicting, why are they conflicting? So here we got 13 AK-47 knockoffs in the back of this U-Haul truck. The dealer had already thought it was suspicious before we got the call. So we seized them. And what happened was my agents called the U.S. Attorney's Office and they were told, now just, seize the guns, let them go. We'll indict it later. Like, okay, I'm new in New York. That would have been all right. Take them to jail. We'll draw up a complaint. You can bring them to the magistrate tomorrow. But here it's like, well, we'll go pick them up later. But again, I'm a brand new supervisor. I was always raised to believe that if, you're going somewhere new, things can be different. Feel things out for a little while. Don't get too far into the weeds unless something's like really a big deal. But that's how they had been doing it out there for years, is let them go. We'll indict it later. So, I would see that scenario unfold again and again and again, and people weren't getting charged. I mean, sometimes we could take the case to the county if the person was a felon because they had a prohibited possessor statute, but we were federal agents. We're supposed to be making federal cases. So then, like a little bit later, there was a case where, for example, ATF looks at guns that are recovered at crime scenes, and if a gun is recovered less than 2 years after it's purchased, sometimes it could be an indication that that gun was trafficked. I mean, it could be legitimate, like could have been stolen out of somebody's car or house. Normally, those would be reported. So we had one case where a gun was used just south of the U.S.-Mexican border in a massive shooting. 21 people were killed, including 4 cops, Mexican cops, and the town was called Cadenea. 4 other cops were kidnapped by cartel folks because down there they don't just do drive-by shootings; they roll in numbers and they do all kinds of things in caravans of armed vehicles. So they kidnapped 4 other cops, took them out into the desert, beat them, left them for dead. So this gun that was found at the scene, it was one of many guns that was used in the crime, had been purchased 48 hours earlier. So normally, if it's less than 2 years, we're going to give it a look. We might not interview anybody. We look at the other circumstances, but 2 days. So we found the person that bought the gun. They admitted, yeah, I bought it. It wasn't for me, which is a crime. I gave it to so and so. So we find that person. He admits, yeah, I got the gun from this guy and I brought it to Mexico. Okay, present that case for prosecution. Declined. So I would see time and time and time again. We would make these stops. We would seize over the 3 years that my group was tasked with doing this. Thousands of guns would wind up in our vault. Very few people went to prison. So now what happened is now I went out to Phoenix in February of 2007. In late 2009, roughly October, my group's focus changed to we were tasked with investigating home invasion, robberies, and kidnappings, which is kind of what I did in New York. Which was comforting because I was getting frustrated with no one going to jail with the firearms trafficking cases. But another group was stood up to investigate Mexico-bound firearms trafficking. It was called Phoenix Group 7. A lot of agents were brought in from around the country. So a lot of them didn't have the knowledge of how fucked up the U.S. Attorney's Office was. They didn't understand the culture of in Arizona because each U.S. Attorney's Office has its own set of priorities. So, but anyway, what starts to happen is those dealers that used to call us are now calling these other agents, but the guns aren't being interdicted. So initially, these gun dealers start calling us and saying, "Hey, man, like, who are these new people? How come they're not seizing the guns? Why are our guns being traced from crime scenes?" Because when we would interdict them, because they weren't being found at crime scenes, they weren't getting traced. And the trace, just for your listeners' awareness, is like a police department will call ATF and say, "Hey, we want this gun traced." So some folks in Martinsburg, West Virginia, which is where our tracing center is, would pick up the phone, call the manufacturer, say, "Hey, this gun, this serial number, when was it made? Where was it shipped?" So it's literally a series of phone calls. And then the final call will go to the dealer who has the form that's filled out when you buy a gun. And they literally will hand search through their forms and say, "Yeah, this gun was bought on this date." So now all of a sudden, these dealers who weren't getting guns traced start getting guns traced from Mexico. So they start to get concerned and they actually call a meeting with ATF and with the U.S. Attorney's Office. And I wasn't there because my group was not involved in that case at all. And they start to protest saying, "Hey, why, we don't want to sell to these people who are suspicious that you've told us to sell because the guns aren't being seized. We don't want somebody to get killed with one of our guns." So what happens is the U.S. Attorney's Office and ATF tell them, "No, continue to sell. We're doing something differently here. Just keep doing it." So again, the guns are not being stopped. They're riding off into the sunset, going across the border, and they're being used in all kinds of carnage in Mexico. I mean, unbelievable crime scenes, downing of helicopters, police helicopters, crazy stuff. But we weren't aware in the other groups that this was happening at this time. We just knew that the dealers were starting to get suspicious. So anyway, a Border Patrol agent named Brian Terry gets killed in December of 2010 on the border, and rumblings start like to leave that group and make it into our building. And so we're starting to hear that the firearms were walking, and we're like, "Are you kidding me? That's not how ATF operates." Like, this went against the grain of how we operated for years. It was astounding to the point where we really didn't believe them. So anyway, I was at a meeting and one of the agents in that other group, who was watching what was going on happening, reached out to Senator Chuck Grassley's office to blow the whistle. His name was John Dodson. And I didn't know John, frankly. I don't know that I ever even met him. May have been at the range with him, but I don't know that I ever even had a conversation with him. And the special agent in charge of the Phoenix Field Division, who's ultimately like the boss of that district, mentions, he goes, "Well, don't be surprised. U.S. Attorney's Office is really pissed off. Don't be surprised if John Dodson doesn't wind up indicted." John, the whistleblower. So I'm thinking to myself at the meeting, I'm like, wait a minute. All of these firearms traffickers that we tried to get them to prosecute that they passed on, and they're thinking of indicting a whistleblower. I went home completely, like, really just pissed off. Like, I didn't even know. I couldn't even see. Like, I got tunnel vision. I was so upset. So I went home that night and told my wife what was going on. And, I was like, I'm thinking of calling Grassley's office to let him know that John's not lying. So my wife's like, "Well, if you don't do that, you're not the man I married." So lo and behold, the following morning, I called up. I got a guy named Brian Downey on the phone, and I was like, "Hey, Brian, I know that John Dodson blew the whistle, and I know that ATF and the Department of Justice are saying that they weren't walking guns, and they're saying that John's a liar because they were. I said, he's not lying. I said, so, subpoena me and I'll tell you everything you want to know. And they did. They subpoenaed me, and it turned into a quite the long ordeal.
So what did happen afterwards?
Well, initially I was deposed because I mean, and if you watch the news now, you see a lot of this stuff going on with like the whole Hunter Biden thing. Like he wants to go testify in the open hearing, but he doesn't want to go to a deposition, and some other witnesses as well. What happens is there's a deposition, right? So you're there behind closed doors. There's no one grandstanding for the cameras. You have staff. They weren't even like the Congress people or Senate people themselves. It was their staffers who were mostly lawyers. So I got deposed at a hotel about 8 blocks from where my office was, again, subpoenaed. And I told them everything. I told them about all the declinations that I went through. There was another case where we had a guy who we were investigating who was smuggling grenades into Mexico and activating them in Mexico, who the U.S. Attorney's Office wouldn't let us charge, hundreds of grenades, supplying the Sinaloa cartel. So I laid all of this out behind closed doors to staffers from Senator Grassley and Senator Leahy's offices, and from Chairman Issa of the Oversight Committee, and the ranking member at the time was a gentleman named Cummings, Elijah Cummings. So their four staff are there, and I tell them everything. So I leave to go back to my office because I didn't, my car was parked at the office. It was a long day. And as I'm walking back to the office, I get a phone call from a person from the U.S. Attorney's Office because I had some friends in the office. Some of them really wanted to do their jobs. And he basically said, "Hey, Pete, everything you said in that room was relayed to the United States Attorney. He's not happy." So here, the U.S. Attorney is the chief federal law enforcement officer of the state of Arizona. So I know that they're not happy with me at this point. And look, part of my job as a group supervisor is to supervise my people. I had people in Phoenix and in Yuma. But the other part is to be that intermediary with the U.S. Attorney's Office when things aren't going well. And they sucked. I mean, that's just, plain. I had some friends that wanted to do their job. They'd come from the county. They were frustrated too. But so now I realize at this point, I'm kind of a marked man. And then a couple of days later, I get a call from another assistant who says, "Hey, man, we need to talk." So I'm like, "Hey, it's fine." And I had friends there. So I met him for coffee, and he slides an email across to me that he had printed out. And it basically said, it's from the U.S. Attorney himself to all members of the U.S. Attorney's Office in Arizona. It said, "Anyone running into Pete Forcelli, even if it's on a weekend having coffee with his family, it is to be reported to me through your chain of command immediately." So I'm like, okay. So I'm sitting having coffee with this guy. Are you going to have to report it? And he goes, "Fuck him. I'm not reporting shit." He goes, "I'm just letting you know." So, but at this point, I realized that this is becoming real. I mean, it's like, wow, here I told the truth and they're not happy with me. And and it continued. I remember there was a period where I was actually surveilled. There were times I'd go out to dinner with my wife and kids, and literally, it wasn't covert surveillance either. It was like in your face surveillance. So, they wanted me to know that they were there. And it became tricky because now, I needed a lawyer at this point, right? So how do you communicate with a lawyer? The lawyers were on the East Coast. Couldn't trust email because the feds, we were able to get emails. You subpoena them, you get them. Couldn't get on the phone because they do wiretaps. And in fact, Fast and Furious, those guys were up on wiretaps on these traffickers anyway. So I mean, so I knew how wiretaps work. So what happened was, for me to go meet with the attorneys meant I had to get on a plane and travel, which got expensive. And around that time, my wife had a knee replacement. So we nearly wound up bankrupted, all because I told the truth. So, I mean, but the allegations went on and on and on for 4 years. And it got to the point where like the Office of Inspector General was investigating this. The Deputy Attorney General's office also came out and conducted an investigation. And the interview was so over the top crazy. I talk about it in the book. The person who was leading the interview was friends with one of the people who was one of the main antagonists that started the whole Fast and Furious case. So I'm like, wow, this is going to be a real accurate investigation. So yeah, it got crazy for a couple of years. Wound up having to leave the state of Arizona. I lost over $200,000 on my house that we put into it and put down on it. And then my daughter had a full ride scholarship to the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism at ASU. And she was getting approached by people. So she didn't feel safe. And she was 17 years old. So me and the family wound up having to leave the state of Arizona and lost a fortune doing it. And then tried to get on with our lives. But the investigation into my character, into some of the stuff that I had done, went on for 4 years. And the weird thing is, like, it was a lot of he said, she said, and the U.S. attorneys, personnel, and she's. you know, it's difficult, like when, because some of it was conversations that we had. So I got to the point where 6 different times I had said, listen, if you do not believe me, put me on the polygraph. You can ask me anything you want about Fast and Furious, about the Kingery grenade case, about anything related to any of this stuff, and I'll answer it open and honestly. And it would always be like, well, that's fine, Pete. We believe you. It's just, he's saying this. So it never amounted to the point where I would put on a polygraph. I finally said, hey, I guarantee you none of them at the U.S. Attorney's Office will volunteer to take a polygraph. So in the end, thank God, all the stuff that I spoke about, I had either witnesses or documents to corroborate, but it took 4 years to clear my name. 4 years of just, looking over my shoulder and waiting for the hammer to drop and wondering what other lies would be thrown into the mix. So it was rough.
Well, what were they covering up? Because the story is so shady, and there's a lot of conspiracy theories that go around why they were doing it, what they were doing exactly. But I mean, they were giving weapons to, I mean, they were getting into the hands of the cartels. They were supposed to be tracked in some way, but there was no way of really tracking them. Like, what's your thoughts on what they said they were doing versus what they were actually doing?
Well, what they said was that they were going to try to take down a cartel, right, with the firearms trafficking, which is asinine because look, the gun trafficking, like straw purchasing, doesn't carry a significant sentence, and dealing without a license doesn't either. Like the narcotics laws are very powerful, and historically they've done cases where they've taken people down, like in other countries for narcotics trafficking into the U.S. So if DEA, with its very robust network of informants down there, they had vetted units, they had a big, a number of DEA agents working in Mexico. If they couldn't do it, the thoughts that ATF was going to do it with straw purchasing laws was just asinine. So one of the things that I think was a driver, and again, I wasn't in the meetings so this is speculation, but I was in meetings where they were pretty gleeful about this thing called Demand Letter 3 coming. So what happens is if you go into a gun store and you buy more than one pistol, it gets reported to ATF, right? If you do the same thing with rifles, it doesn't. So if you go buy two-shot Derringers, a report is generated and ATF can, find out. And look, some people do that and it's completely legit. Like I remember one guy bought 19 Glock Model 19s in Arizona and we were notified about it. And it was like, okay, most collectors don't buy 19 of the same gun. So we called the guy, said, hey man, would you mind coming in? He goes, I know why you're calling. So he said, look, I'll come in. He goes, I'm starting up a security guard company. He goes, my plan is to buy guns and I'm going to, issue them. Hey, fine. And he did. He brought in paper. He was fine. He was good to go. So, I mean, it wasn't even really a contentious discussion. We moved on. But now what happened in the time that Fast and Furious was going on, there was this push that they were thinking, hey, if we can get this multiple sale form requirement for rifles, that would be great. So they pushed to have that implemented, and it's currently in place in the border states. So California, New Mexico, Texas, Arizona. If you buy more than one rifle, it gets reported on that same form, the multiple sale form. So that's what I think was also a bit of a driving factor. But yeah, the guns that we were interdicting never hurt anybody because they wound up in our vault. So I mean, yeah, nobody went to jail. They should have. In the Fast and Furious, the guns were allowed to be trafficked to Mexico so that they could be traced, and they would put those dots on the map together to try to determine where the hotspots were for the cartel and take down networks. How they thought they were going to do that still escapes me, and I've had 12 years to think about it. But yeah, I mean, it was appalling. But look, one gun being trafficked into the wrong hands is a bad thing. These weren't being trafficked to hunters or regular folks who just didn't want to be on the radar, so they didn't want to put something on paper. They weren't being trafficked to target shooters. They were being trafficked to cartel butchers who were killing other human beings in Mexico. So there's no defense for it. I mean, it's indefensible.
Uh, Absolutely, but I'm still confused on the why. If it couldn't be tracked, why else would they do it? Have you come up with any of your own theories on why you think they would let the cartels get these guns? Why weren't they more upset that it was getting in hands of violent cartel members and were being used for all this violence? Because it seems like you're one of the few that were actually upset about all this.
Well, you can't track the gun per se, but they were tracing the gun when it was found. But think about how appalling this is. They're tracing it when it's found at a crime scene. Well, a crime scene means somebody's dead or shot, right? So you couldn't, like to your point, you couldn't track its movements, right? And there were times where they would put trackers in to watch certain things. The tracker wouldn't last very long. And once it crossed into Mexico, you can't follow it. So, I mean, it didn't make any sense. But what they were trying to do was trying to use those pinpoints on the map where those recoveries were to collect intelligence to build a case and take down the cartel. But part of the problem, and this is the thing that really wasn't discussed back then, is everybody pointed fingers at ATF. And look, again, I'm not going to defend the indefensible. They should have had fingers pointed at them. But a lot of the decisions that were made by lawyers, and that's why if you look at the title of my book, it's The Deadly Path: How Operation Fast and Furious and Bad Lawyers Armed Mexican Cartels. Because there were times where some of the agents actually wanted to stop cars, and the lawyers would say, well, you really can't prove that this person isn't buying this particular gun for themselves. Like, how do you know it's a straw purchase? One of the straw purchasers in Fast and Furious, a guy named Osario, bought over 800 firearms before the U.S. Attorney's Office thought it was worth indicting him, right? Not in one shot either. This is over the course of many, many months, but 800 firearms, many of which were already being recovered in Mexico. And this prosecutor's like, well, how do we prove this one's not for him? In fact, there was another purchase that took place at the Scottsdale Gun Club, which was a cooperative dealer, good place. They always cooperated with us. That one of the straw purchasers who's committing a felony, right? But it's an act of deception. When you go in, the dealer doesn't know you're a straw purchaser, right? They knew in this instance because ATF was on their phones and said, hey, he's coming, we'll be outside. But again, no interdiction planned. Well, one of the straw purchasers sees the surveillance team and thinks they're about to get ripped off. So they call the Scottsdale Police Department. The Scottsdale Police Department, unbeknownst to them, doesn't know that this is an ATF surveillance, right? They come, show up, and they wound up escorting the straw purchasers off the site so that they wouldn't get robbed, not knowing they were straw purchasers, not knowing the people that the straw purchasers were suspicious of were ATF agents. I mean, that's how crazy and off the hook things got out there.
I guess what I'm trying to figure out is, was it just a bad plan, and was it just people who were just making poor decisions, or do you think something deeper, something else was going on? Was there, was there some connection? Did they know that it was a bad plan? They're letting it happen, or was it just like, like you said, like just a dumb plan? Like, hey, you can't track them. You're gonna trace them, but by the time you do that, there's gonna be victims, and they could use these weapons for all these horrible things. Like, do you think it was just some awful thinking and just an awful strategy, or was there something more going on?
Well, I think it's a little bit of both, actually. I think what happened was this started as just a shitty idea, like a bad strategy, right? But look, for years, when we were doing things the right way, no one went to jail, which I think is important to remember. Like, we did things the way cops do things all over the country and in other countries, and we were always told, no, we can't indict it, or no, take them to the county. So I think part of that factored into let's try something different. Why they came up with this idea is mind-blowing and incredibly stupid. But I think that factored into it. Then you had an attorney that was involved who was a moron. I mean, who just, he was afraid, trigger shy, didn't like to work very hard. So every time they would say, hey, do we have enough? We're like, no, we need more. We need more. So these numbers are growing and growing. But that means bodies are dropping on the other side of the border. And then, of course, the Border Patrol agent, Brian Terry, gets killed, which is what led to John Dodson blowing the whistle. But I do believe that there were also people, because I know that I read some of the documents, that this was being briefed all the way up to the White House, right? And I also, that meant it passed through Eric Holder's desk. They knew. Now, what I think happened is they embraced some of this as an opportunity to push for that demand letter 3 that I spoke about with the multiple sale requirement. I believe it helped because, look, they are very anti-gun, that administration. I believe that it also helped them talk about all the carnage happening and how it would help to allow for more gun laws and more gun restrictions, or perhaps even a gun ban. So I think you had this perfect storm of idiocy in Phoenix and shitty leadership, frankly, because anybody could have called foul and said, hey, we're not doing this anymore. You know what? If the U.S. Attorney's Office doesn't want to prosecute those cases, or they want to let these straw buyers keep buying, take it to the county, take it to the state attorney general's office. That's why I say it's inexcusable. They had other things they could have done. So, but I think that's what happened is you had this shit show happening in Phoenix. And then you had some people in DC, and perhaps in Phoenix as well, that decided, hey, let's not let a good tragedy go to waste. Let's find a way to use this to implement some new laws or some new policies that would restrict access to firearms.
Yeah, and I think some evidence that that was their motivation is the fact that nobody really got in trouble, right?
Well, that's not true either, though. What I'll say is this: there were people in ATF that got fired. Not everybody who deserved to get fired got fired, and some people were removed because they were in headquarters, right, and they just weren't paying attention. Well, guess what? That's their job. Your job is to pay attention to what's happening with the folks underneath you, right? Um, so there were some folks who got fired who deserved it. There were some who didn't get fired who should have been fired, but none of the lawyers were touched, which is one of the things that really upset me because the lawyers, in some ways, were the architects of this. And in DOJ, which is the Department of Justice, it's run by lawyers. So there were a lot of people who were scapegoated, but there's also some folks who got to stick around, and some of them have been promoted and are in decision-making places right now. And no one ever called them out, which was one of the reasons, not the only reason. It's one of the reasons why I thought it was important to write the book, was to let folks know what really happened out there, and also to name names. Because, look, I've held myself accountable for mistakes I made. We talked about that much earlier where we started. I think that we have a duty to hold people accountable for things that go wrong and for people to own their mistakes. But here, everybody pointed fingers at the ATF folks, and everybody else kind of backed off with their hands up and just let the other people just get a pass, which is really unconscionable.
Yeah, I mean, it always seems like when you learn about these stories that the people at the higher ups never get in trouble, right? There's always some scapegoat. There's always some people who get thrown, under the bus. And it's like, well, if they're responsible, what about everybody higher up than them that knew it was happening or let it happen and didn't put a stop to it? Why aren't they responsible? It just Eric Holder is a perfect example of it, right? He like you said, he must have known what was going on. He didn't get in trouble, the administration didn't get in trouble. And I think it is one of those perfect examples of, like, sometimes it seems like people who come up with these theories that, like, oh, the government's trying to take away your guns, the government's, and it's like, it sounds crazy, but then when you hear stories like this where it's like, well, now they literally use a tragic event to try to implement stricter gun rights, like it's like this stuff does happen, and it's
Yeah. Well, let me expand on it. First thing I'll say is when look, sometimes the cover up is worse than the actual incident. Brian Terry was killed, so I'm not going to say that because it's that's about as bad as it gets. Then you consider the carnage in Mexico. What I will say is Ken Melson was the director of ATF at the time. He was the acting director because we didn't have a Senate confirmed director. And to his credit, like, the DOJ was like telling him, "You will not speak to Congress. You will not speak to Congress," right? Because they were covering shit up. They didn't want to. They wanted anybody to think that Holder knew. So what happened was on July 4th of 2011, which is a holiday, right? So Ken Melson went and met with Congress against DOJ's orders. So he broke the rules and went. And he did it on a holiday because he figured DC is a ghost town, right? No one's going to be looking. His bodyguard detail was off. So he went and sat down and was honest with them. And I know this because I spoke to the Senate staffers that debriefed him, and they were like, wow. So, I mean, but that's the extent that they were going. They were going to tell an agency head, you're not to talk to Congress. So how are you owning mistakes when you're covering things up? They didn't release a lot of the documents in Fast and Furious into, I believe it was like 2020, that DOJ, and you got to remember that administrations have changed. All these lawyers were protecting the documents so that Congress couldn't have access to them for almost 9 years, right? And here's the icing on the cake. Like I said, the gun dealers used to call us, and the way it would work is they would call us when they saw something suspicious, and we would roll out there and we would do an interdiction, right? If we couldn't get out there, they would say to the buyer, "Hey, you know what? You didn't pass the NICS check. You're going to have to come back tomorrow." And we would be there the following day or the following day after that. And then if there were times where, like, we just didn't have the bandwidth to do it, they would just not make the sale. So they weren't selling guns and calling us after the fact. They were helping us make cases. So roughly 90% of the gun trafficking cases that we made, whether it was from gun stores or even from gun shows, came from the dealers, the licensed dealers. They were good Americans. They were legitimate business people selling a lawful commodity, right? So when Fast and Furious happened, like I said before, those dealers' guns weren't being interdicted. Well, when they called that meeting with ATF and the U.S. Attorney's Office, their lawyers were there, right? And ATF told them, and the U.S. Attorney, a guy named Emery Hurley, and I talk about him in the book extensively. They tell these dealers who didn't want to sell anymore, no, keep selling, right? Those dealers are right now being sued by the government of Mexico for doing exactly what ATF and federal prosecutors told them to do. Talk about a betrayal. Here, these people were informants, not paid informants in the literal sense, but I mean they were like good neighbors who called the police. Us being the people who police the firearms traffic in the firearms industry, when things were not right, like when they were suspicious, they would call us. And now those same folks are being abandoned by ATF and by the Department of Justice in this lawsuit that Mexico has filed against them. Instead of holding the people who were actually involved in the trafficking of the firearms, the straw purchasers and the traffickers and the cartel people using the guns in Mexico, they're now going after the people who were at once our allies, which I think is, and that's a new revelation, by the way, which I think is absolutely appalling. And it goes against the grain of everything that I did for 35 years.
So, and why is that, you think? Why wouldn't they want to, why would they tell them to continue selling when they know that potentially, this could lead to horrible, outcomes? Like, was it just the lack of resources to kind of follow up on everything?
No, they wanted that Fast and Furious case to turn into this big giant case with a lot of guns. And to your point, I think part of it was that the higher those numbers went, the bigger the ask would be for more gun control laws. And at a minimum, it was to implement Demand Letter 3, which worked. I mean, Demand Letter 3 is in effect on the border states. But yeah, that's why they told them to keep selling, is because of that case. So here, those folks that did exactly what they were told to by people in government, some high-ranking folks, are being sued by the government of Mexico. And yet, some of the people whose hands were dirtiest in actually bringing the guns to Mexico, the straw purchasers, the people funding the straw purchasers, a couple of people went to jail in Fast and Furious, but those legions and legions of traffickers that I spoke of earlier that got passes, no one ever went and rounded them up. We had folks that the U.S. Attorney's Office would make a decision till well after the statute of limitations would expire, which is 5 years. It's like, really, it takes you 5 years to make a decision about whether or not you're going to prosecute a case? It's unconscionable.
And it does remind me so much of 9/11. For just people weren't held responsible, and a lot of people got a pass, and just there's a lot of, for lack of a better term, fuckery going on with that.
Yeah, and you know whose lives were turned upside down? Look, I obviously I told you about my circumstance, but there were other whistleblowers, because John Dodson testified with me. He was thrown out of the state of Arizona. Another agent that testified with me at the hearing, this is one that was televised, was Lee Casa. He had to leave the state of Arizona. None of us wanted to leave our homes. Then you had Carlos Canino, who was the head of the Mexico office. He had to leave Mexico. He became a marked man. He wasn't even involved. Carlos didn't even know what was going on. Carlos was very good friends with the Mexican attorney general. And I remember the day that they finally got around to indicting and charging the Fast and Furious straw purchasers, including the one that bought 800 guns, Carlos, because none of us believed that they were walking guns when that first was being, alleged. We were like, no, that's ATF agents don't do that. Carlos had told the Attorney General of Mexico, who he was friends with, this guy Dodson's probably not telling the truth, because Carlos believed what most other people believed. So Carlos came up and read the documents at the takedown. And I remember, this was a tough guy. Carlos had done undercover work, going after some really violent, bad people and motorcycle gangs, home invaders. And I remember him sitting next to me, and literally he got like weak kneed. He goes, Pete, I think I'm going to fucking throw up. He goes, I can't believe this. Carlos is an emotional guy. And I'm like, I told you, Carlos. He goes, no, you don't understand. I got to go back to Mexico now and tell the Attorney General, who he called her by her first name, I think it was Maricela, that I fucking lied to her. He goes, I never believed in a million years that we would do this. And here I'm reading it, that we actually walked guns. He goes, now I got to go and tell this person who's a friend of mine that I fucking lied to her, pardon my language, and that we walked all of these guns. And I'm like, yeah, look, we didn't know what was going on. And that's the thing that kind of bothers me too, is, there were several different groups in Phoenix. I was the supervisor of one. Phoenix 7 was into a group. None of the other groups were involved in this. So, I mean, when it's like when I was an NYPD cop, I was there in that department the time when that guy sodomized Abner Luima with the plunger. I don't know if you remember that story, right? every cop in the eyes of the public put a plunger up his backside. Well, we had the same problem in Phoenix where, every cop that saw an ATF agent thought, oh, you guys walk guns. And even in other parts of the country, ATF agents in New York and in Texas, oh, you're from Phoenix, you're one of those assholes that walk guns. No, it wasn't. But we all wore that stain. But the unfortunate part is all of the whistleblowers, Carlos, myself, Larry, John, other people, Jose Wall, who worked for me, who later testified at the second hearing, we all had to go. We all were retaliated against in some way, shape, or form, and yet they protected some of the people who were directly involved in the incident.
That's wild. So for people listening who want to learn more about the case, where can they get your book, and what other is it specifically on the Fast and Furious operation, and what other topics do you dive deep into in your book, and where can they get it, all the best spots to purchase it and all that stuff?
Sure. Look, my book does not focus exclusively on Fast and Furious. It talks about what led to Fast and Furious. It talks about the cases I spoke of earlier where we weren't getting prosecution because a path was paved that led to Fast and Furious. So it talks about how we got there. And a lot of it was through the inaction of the U.S. Attorney's Office. It talks about the scandal itself, and then it talks about what happened afterwards. It also talks about a case that's not very often discussed that kind of got buried, which was the same assistant U.S. attorney that was the kind of the quarterback of the Fast and Furious case, refused to charge a guy who was in essence the armorer to the Sinaloan cartel, who was making grenades for them, who was taking the guns that were being smuggled into Mexico and turning them into machine guns. He got a pass when he was caught red-handed crossing the border with disassembled grenades in his tire. It'll blow their minds. So, but it's the deadly path, and it's how Operation Fast and Furious and bad lawyers arm Mexican cartels. It's available for pre-order on Amazon now, and it'll be on the shelves of bookstores on March 5th. There's other books that have been written about Fast and Furious. One was written by Katie Pavlich. It was called Operation Fast and Furious: Obama's Deadliest Scandal. Good book. I thought it was a little too political and didn't get into some of the peripheral issues. And then John Dodson wrote a book about the scandal itself. But he was not there in Phoenix to see the things that happened prior to that with all of these traffickers getting a pass. So, I mean, his book doesn't really explain how the scandal came to be, but he discusses the scandal itself.
Yeah, it from just my understanding of your book, it sounds like it goes much further back into the origin story of it all, and what led to that. And yes, it can be used as a political tool to bash the administration that was in power. But obviously, I think this is much deeper than that, and I think it really is a a issue that it exists regardless, which who's in power and who the president is. So without a doubt, I mean, do you have just because of your background and all the things you've been involved in, what's your opinion on what's going on with like the border? Obviously, a lot of people have opinions on what's happening, if they're letting it happen, if there's some reason to why they're letting it happen. How violent are the people that are coming into the country? Like, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't agree with what's going on now. And look, I am not into politics. I kind of despise politicians. I think that it's become a blood sport. And I think that there's a lot of dirty folks on both sides of the aisle, frankly. But look, if we can't have a secure border, then we're not a country, right? So you look at what's going on with the fentanyl that's coming into the United States, right? We're losing 100,000 kids a year. That's more than we've lost in Vietnam or other wars. So you have that. You have some of the gangs that are coming across. Like my understanding is Venezuela emptied out their prisons and sent them here. Now there's talk with this Tren de Aragua gang that's robbing people of cell phones in New York City. They basically rob you of your cell phone. They use your Apple Pay till it runs out. And then they ship the phone to Colombia where it gets wiped and resold into the black market down there. My understanding is Biden had made comments that he was going to send them back to Venezuela, and Maduro saying, fuck you, we're not taking them back. So, I mean, they're sending us people who we don't want on our streets. You have crime completely out of control right now in parts of New York City, Chicago, and even some of these big city mayors, who many of them are Democrats, are telling the federal government, hey, man, get off your ass and fix this problem. But it's scary. My understanding is there could be as many as 10 million people who have gotten into this country who shouldn't be here. And look, I laugh when people say we're a nation of immigrants. We are. Your ancestry is Portuguese. We spoke about it. My background is Italian, Irish. My ancestors, when they came here not that long ago, they sat on Ellis Island until the government knew they weren't criminals and they didn't have leprosy or TB or some other communicable disease. They didn't just waltz in, get a hotel room in Manhattan, get handed a debit card and cell phone, and go about their lives without any repercussions. It's frightening, frankly. And then look, being a 9/11 survivor, I know it only took 19 people on that day to do what they did. We have people crossing the border who are on terror watch lists. I know there's over 140, last I heard, that we know of. What about the ones that aren't coming across at a port of entry, who are crossing at the areas where there's no fence? We don't know. We have no idea. I mean, 10 million people, that's bigger than the population of Manhattan. So it scares me. And I hope that they get their shit together and stop, with all this political sword fighting and actually take efforts to secure the border, because the Border Patrol knows how to do it. They're just not being allowed to do it.
Yeah, well, without doubt. I mean, like you said, I'm also immigrant. My wife's Italian, even though she was born here. Her ancestors are Italian. Obviously, we all come from a different country. But when we had to come here, when my parents came here, they had to know people and they had to have family here, and you had to have some evidence or some reason to believe that you're going to contribute in a positive way to the country. And that's not what's happening right now. And eventually, and you see it in I call it Chinafornia, which was coined by my friend Miriam Haneen. But Chinafornia, and you see what's going on in New York. Like, the crime's just completely off the wall. People are afraid of being in those cities and states, and it just seems like what possible motivation could this all be? And you hear stories of, like, if you join the military as a illegal, they're letting you vote, or they're letting you become a citizen. Like, all these things are circulating about possible motivations. Obviously, we talked about Fast and Furious and Operation Fast and Furious and how they use that as a tragic thing. You never let a tragedy go to waste, and politicians, like you said, it's probably the dirtiest of sports, so they'll never let anything that they can't use go to waste. What is this? In your opinion, do you think that somebody's going to use this tragedy to go to waste, or to make sure it doesn't go to waste, or they similar to Fast and Furious, they're letting it happen and they're involved in it happening, and there's if there is some end game, if there is some reason to why they're letting it happen, what's your opinion on that?
It's a guess. 'Cause I'm not in the room. I think candidly, I think it's for votes. I think they want people to come in and vote. And some people will say, "Oh, you're a conspiracy theorist for saying that." But I mean, I can't think of a logical reason why you're letting folks in here without vetting them, right? And then let's look at the crime that's going unchecked. Like, why aren't we prosecuting people for things that are against the law? Well, is it, I have a theory on that too. It's because, a lot of folks who are out there committing crimes, right? If they get convicted of felonies in some places, you can't vote anymore. So, you know what? Why charge them? Why take them off the streets? Why convict them and make them non-voters when we can have them on our side? So let's just take it easy on them and leave them out there and let them keep committing crime, because at least they'll be able to cast that vote. I think that factors into it a bit. I know that's probably an unpopular theory and probably will piss some people off to hear it, but that's all I can come up with at this point, because I don't understand how anybody thinks it's rational to allow someone to go in and completely loot everything off the shelves of a Walgreens or a store. I mean, look, you have, in certain parts of the country, you have pharmacies that are closing, right? Because they're tired of getting looted and they can't afford to stay in business. Well, that means that the people that we were talking about in the beginning of our conversation, those people who are normal people that live in those neighborhoods, well, now they can't access pharmaceutical products or drugs. So how is this benefiting society to allow criminals to run amok? So there has to be an end game for them, because they're not stupid people. They're sneaky people, but they're not stupid people.
Yeah, it seems like they're for some motivation that they're trying to destroy America from the inside out. I mean, it just seems, I am a conspiracy theorist because I've had so many whistleblowers on the show. I've had so many historians. I mean, the history's full of conspiracies, and you can't be into history and not uncover conspiracy after conspiracy after conspiracy. So, and like you said, and a lot of those conspiracies is because politicians and empires, they're dirty. They'll do anything, anything they can to stay in power for whatever agenda they might have. So, without a doubt, there's something going on. I'm unfortunately going to be, kind of just waiting and seeing where this all goes, and hopefully people get upset, and hopefully people it gets to a point where they have to do something. I mean, even as a police, somebody who was a police officer, retired police officer, I mean, could you even imagine working in New York City right now, or a
No,
California right now? I mean,
no, I can't. And look, it's not even just that. I mean, look what's going on at the border. Going back to the border, right? It's so out of control that you have federal air marshals and U.S. Bureau of Prison guards helping down there just process people. Well, Bureau of Prisons and the Air Marshal Service weren't exactly overstaffed. So now our skies are less safe, our prisons are less safe, right? Because they're dealing with this influx of people coming across the border. They're letting people in where prior to this administration, it was the remain in Mexico policy that was removed. So these people are coming in and we have no idea where they're going. And then you have these non-governmental organizations, right? Catholic Charities is one. You have the Red Cross that are giving these folks money to help them get here. Why? What's the end game? And look, I wish I could figure it all out. But I agree with you. I think that there has to be this movement where people just finally say, hey, enough's enough. Like, look at this young lady that was murdered in Georgia, nursing student, right? By that guy who shouldn't even be here. From where? From Venezuela. Venezuela, again, we can't even deport this guy now because Maduro said he's not taking any of his people back. It's just, how did we get to this place? It blows my mind. And then look, going back, how many more people have to die of fentanyl poisoning before we seal the border and also start imposing, something on China, who's willingly sending the fentanyl precursors to Mexico. There are Chinese nationals in Mexico helping them synthesize these pills. The Mexicans got apparently the pill press machines at cost from the Chinese government. So China's hands are involved in this too. It's like, when are we going to wake up and worry about protecting our country and stop trying to keep the rest of the world and bad actors happy?
have you heard about the Chinese coming in through the border?
Yes. Military age folks, a lot of them, and they're flying to Tijuana and just walking across. So unlike some of these immigrants that are coming from other third world countries that are like literally going to, walking the entire through Panama, through the Darien Gap, which is very dangerous, and walking all the way up through Mexico. You have people that are literally flying into Tijuana and then walking across the border. A lot of them coming from China.
It's wild. I mean, I just can't even see the argument. And I believe me, I try. Anytime I have a opinion on something, I try really hard to be like, okay, let me not plant my flag here. Let me hear the alternative argument. I could be wrong. There could be some information I'm not entertaining. Maybe I jumped to a conclusion too soon. And I just cannot find any argument, any logical argument on how this is good in any way or manner. It is just insanity. And like you said, one thing that we know for certain is that, like we keep saying, politicians never let a good tragedy go to waste. There is a greater plan. If you zoom out, you might not see, because it's always baby steps in a direction, right? It's like a giant, chessboard, and they're just using pawns for the greater plan. And that's kind of the outcome that I'm thinking about too. It has to be election motivated. It has to be, people who don't want to see America do well,
Yeah.
who are funding and pushing for this, and people need to speak out, and people need to come together and realize these aren't political issues. This is a America issue. This
Yes.
is every person who lives in this country issue.
Yeah. No, look, I think that they're taking a lot of these folks are taking their marching orders from people like George Soros, from the World Economic Forum, for people who have globalist agendas. I'm sure those people are making a lot of money with their globalist agendas, but who's getting, the short end of the stick? It's the average regular American taxpayer. And it's sad to see that special interest has so much influence over government. It's really tragic because I don't think most of the American people approve of what's happening in our country right now.
Yeah, I remember years ago I had Jack Abramoff on the show who there was that movie Casino Jack about his life, and he was at the time the most powerful lobbyist in American history. And I mean, he talks about how like lobbyists will just give, a politician language like put this in the bill. And they're like, okay, they don't have to
Mhm.
read it, they don't approve it, they don't have to, they just care about funding, they care about money, they care about keeping their job. And that's the world we live in. And
Yeah.
it is one I think about, just anybody who wants to be a politician, I feel like should not have the right to be a politician. I mean, anybody who would want that job, you are literally being molded into a illusion that it's okay to lie on a daily basis and promise things you can't possibly give and tell people what they want to hear all the time. I mean, you literally live in a fake world where everybody is backstabbing, everybody's just trying to make deals, and it's just it's really the worst of the worst people, it seems like. And not to say just like in other jobs, like there are some people out there. I mean, I was a big Ron Paul fan. I feel like Dennis Kucinich is a decent guy. I've had Jesse Ventura on years ago. I think he ran for the right reasons, but he also made a really good point. He's like, why would anybody spend millions of dollars to get a job that pays thousands of dollars, right? It doesn't make any sense. It's like because there's other reasons, right? So, but I can't, I've taken up a lot of your time, Peter. Thank you so much for sharing some of your wisdom and some of your personal experiences and stories. I love just being able to share these life experiences with my listeners, and I'm sure they're going to get a lot from it. I will put links in the show description to your book. I believe you have a website too. Are you on any social media platforms also?
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Twitter. Well, now X.
Yeah.
I have a Facebook profile. I'm on Instagram. But no, it's been a pleasure being here, Ricky. I appreciate the invite. It's been great chatting with you. And yeah, let's both hope and pray that our country takes a turn for the better, and that public safety and national security become a priority again.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. I'll send you links to the show once it's up and live. If there's any specific links or anything you want in the show description, please send them to me, and we'll keep in touch. Keep up the amazing work, and we'll definitely do our best to learn from people like yourself who've been through these life experiences, and enjoy what is actually a sunny day today, weirdly enough. Are you
Yes.
back on the East Coast, or you?
I live just outside of DC. So yeah, it's a beautiful day here today.
Oh,
I think
nice.
it's like 65 degrees.
Yeah, awesome. Beautiful. Well, thanks, Peter. Hey, enjoy the rest of your day. We'll keep in touch. Take care.
You got it. Take care, Ricky. Thank you.